Hi, my name is Kevin Wong. I'm the director of the Desert Institute at Joshua Tree National Park. This symposium is a partnership with Copper Mountain College. We've been conducting it for 6 years now. It's a biennial event, meaning it's every 2 years. This is the first of 3 that we'll be doing, one in this month, January, again in February, and again in March. So I want to thank Copper Mountain College for letting us use this facility to promote very important and critical topics that affect all of us, and the first one is climate change. In fact, we have 2 events that we're going to be talking about climate change. So thank you very much to Copper Mountain College. I have a shout out to Paul Delaney, Dr. Paul Delaney. He's the chair of the science department. Paul has been our partner in this for all 6 years, and he's done a wonderful job. Another shout out is to a young lady, Yanina Adao, who is the Pasadena Garden Club's intern and she's been doing work on early blooming of Joshua trees. So Yanina, congratulations and thank you for your work. She's one of Paul Delaney's students and she's done a great job. I want to thank our Joshua Tree National Park Association for supporting us in this. We have Jackie Guevara off to the left there, as well as a number of our board members. I saw Joe Zarki and Bill Truesdale here, so thank you for being here. Oh, and Lorraine, I'm sorry, I did say hello to you earlier. You're right. Other shout outs for Mojave Desert Land Trust and also for the Morongo Basin Conservation Association. I see a number of their members here too. These are organizations that do incredible conservation jobs within our area, and I want to thank them for always being part of this, and congratulations to all of you for your very, very, very good work. 2 little but major announcements. Please turn off your cell phones. There's nothing worse than that ring going off during a presentation. And the second is the obscure directions to the bathrooms. You go through the weight room to the open doors on the far side that's lit up, go through to the next hall. Men's are to the right, ladies to the left. Don't use the first door you see. Make a slight turn to the right or a slight turn to the left and use the second door. If you have any problems, I'll be in. No, that's not a correct statement. If you get lost, I'll be around and I'll help direct you on how to get to the bathroom. So that's not on the tape, is it, Bob? He just said yes. Okay. This event will be videotaped and will be uploaded to the Desert Institute YouTube channel. So if you have any friends that want to know more about what we did, I will send you all an email link to the YouTube channel so that you can see it once again and share it with all of your friends. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Daren Otten, who is the president and superintendent of the Copper Mountain Community College District, who will be our master of ceremonies and moderator tonight. And he will in turn introduce our panelists to you. So, bathroom issues, I'm in the back. Thank you.
Good evening, folks. I just have to say, first and foremost, thank you all for being here. It is truly an honor for us here at Copper Mountain College to partner with the Desert Institute, Joshua Tree National Park. And, you know, I'm very new to this basin. I just took this job here in July. And the affinity for not only this college, but this community is something that continues to amaze me. I'm thrilled tonight because, like all of you, I'm going to get to learn something. As a new guy to the neighborhood, and wherever Yanni's sitting at, she is the person that has educated me so far on a lot of the things Joshua Tree, and I'm looking forward to my continuing education this evening, as I'm sure all of you are. So with that, I'd love to introduce our panelists this evening, and the way that this is going to ultimately work is that each one of our panelists has got a short presentation that they'll be sharing with us, and then there's going to be some cards being passed around the room. Kevin's holding those up. If you have questions, feel free to write those questions onto the card. And then after the presentations, all three presentations are done, I will try to hopefully decipher some handwriting and then also, pronounce any fancy words that all you smart folks who know about this neighborhood write on those cards so that I can ask some questions. And your questions will help me look like I know what I'm talking about. So I'm looking for your help on that particular component. So with that, I'd like to introduce first to my left Dr. Lynn Sweet. Dr. Lynn Sweet is a research scientist at the University of California, Riverside. She's working out of the Palm Desert campus. She studied invasive exotic plants for her PhD work at UCR and has studied plant ecology in the coastal and foothill woodland ecosystems as well as the desert. Her work currently focuses on the distribution of plants and animals in the landscape of the Mojave and Colorado deserts. Welcome, Dr. Sweet. I'm going to do the rest of the introductions real quick. Second, we have Chris Clark. Chris Clark is the Associate Director of the National Park Conservation Association's California Desert Program. He works for an advocate for national parks, preserves, and monuments in California's desert. Prior to working with NPCA, he was a longtime environmental journalist whose work focused on change in the landscape of the western U.S. He has lived in the Mojave Desert since 2008 and has been in love with the deserts of the Southwest since the early 1980s. Please welcome Chris Clark. Finally, Neil Frakes, farthest to my left. Neil started as the vegetation manager at Joshua Tree National Park in 2015. His work focuses on native plant restoration, invasive plant management, and vegetation monitoring. He holds a master's in geography from the University of Colorado at Boulder, and prior to working for the National Park Service, he worked for the U.S. Forest Service in the Forest Inventory and Analyst Program. He grew up in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. So this evening, obviously we've got some rock stars here, and I'm super excited for all of us to have an opportunity to learn from them and then engage in a conversation. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Sweet.
Thank you. Good evening. Let me get settled in here. All right. Got this. Got my clicker. Can you hear me if I stay close enough? Okay. Great. Well, it's so wonderful to be here. Joshua Tree's got a lot of attention this summer and fall, and I did a lot of talks in different places, and people are excited about Joshua Trees, but maybe not as excited as the hometown crowd. So I'm excited to be talking to people who live amongst this beautiful ecosystem as well as I. So I'm going to be talking about a study that I participated in along with the park as a partner, studying the shifting landscapes of Joshua Tree National Park, looking particularly at Joshua trees. So just acknowledging my co-authors on the paper, which are Cameron Barrows and the others here, but especially Neil Frakes, who's with us this evening. Okay, and also I just want to give a real shout out to the park partners. Some of these young folks and older folks did a lot of the field work on this, so a few of these guys measured many thousands of Joshua trees actually for this study. So I want to acknowledge their hard work that they put into this study as well. And we're just honored at UCR, Cam and I and the others, to be working with the park so closely on this research project. So I wanted to give that shout out and thank you. As well, an important component of this project is our community science program. We've had many volunteers come in. Community scientists participate in the research with us, and we gain as much as I hope the folks gain by working with us. It's a fantastic time. We've had school kids out. We've had all sorts of Earthwatch groups, many community scientists that have helped us accomplish this research, and we couldn't do it without them. So thanks to them as well. So the Southwest parks are unfortunately threatened by climate change. Up here is a photo of Patrick Gonzalez, who's actually here recently talking about climate change. He is the national climate change scientist for the National Park Service and a professor at UC Berkeley. And he works with us a little bit on the science for this study. So I've had the honor to talk to him about this a bit. And he's published research that has shown that the arid Southwest is really seeing some of the most sharp declines in precip and changes in the contiguous 48 states. as well. We're seeing increasing levels of aridity that haven't been seen for at least 1,400 years. So we're seeing a really dry, hotter climate that's happening. And then if you notice, that's the same photo that was taken the other day. So, yep, up on. Does anyone know what trail that is? Any guesses? Trail nearby. Highview Nature Trail. So just about near the top, looking to the west, in Gorgonio there. So, yeah. So we've got, okay, so, climate change. We've got the highest level of CO2 in 800,000 years going on. We have the additional CO2 that's in the atmosphere isotopically matches fossil fuels as opposed to natural sources. So that's really a tie to what's happening. The higher CO2 levels, physically produce higher temperatures. That's been shown physically by physical scientists. And an analysis of all the factors that could be contributing to increase in temperatures shows that less than 3% of that increase could be attributed to any factor other than human causes. So less than 3% by any other cause. All right, and the other bad news is that here is a picture of, on the x-axis, so the bottom axis there is a timeline running from 1960 to 2100, and then annual average maximum temperature. And this was a study that was put together by UC Riverside and partners, looking particularly at the inland deserts. And you can find this summary online if you're interested. It has a really great summary for policymakers and I think for educators as well. So if you want to check that out, go ahead and see it. But essentially they looked at a range of scenarios of future temperatures towards end of century. And those are those lines running off to the right towards 2100. And so we could see, and this is including Coachella Valley, of course, not just up here, temperatures, annual average max temperatures going from around 80, to around 90 by end of century. So this is a big, jump. So this is what we might see. So this is what climatologists work really hard to produce these projections for us so we can do something as biologists. So as biologists, we're trying to look at, well, what's going to happen? How can we best get information that'll help protect these ecosystems and these species? And one way we want to do that is to look at, okay, we know where the species are now, let's study that and get distribution in space and model where the habitat is for the species. And then let's look at where it could be in the future. And then look at where do those areas overlap. So if you are let's say you are a coyote, you maybe could move 20 miles, 100 miles, doesn't matter. But if you're a Joshua tree, it's really hard for you to jump into new habitat really quickly, obviously, even over many generations. So what we're focusing on is, let's say on the right, this is also from Highview Nature Trail, as you might see, I like it up there. You're looking at a distribution in space in the red. Let's say there was an imaginary species distributed in space just like that, and that's currently. And in the future, let's say it's distributed just like that in the yellow. To the future. So for an organism to exist in the future, they're going to have to make it to that yellow space. But if they just if they can't move, they can't disperse, they could hang around in that orange space in the middle that overlaps. And that's what we call refugia. It's a refuge, a place in the landscape that maybe won't experience as much pressure of climate change, changes in temperature, or the species can just exist in situ. So that's what we call refugia, and that's what we wanted to look at as part of this project for Joshua trees and as well as other species. So this is our overall project on Joshua Tree National Park. So we have a climate change collaborative project. We actually look at a variety of, we look at lizards, we look at other plants and animals in the landscape. And what we're focusing on is trying to understand these distributions in Joshua Tree National Park and where the species are now and where they might go. And there's all these what we call gradients, which are changes in some resource over space. So we have more summer rainfall to the east, and then we have more winter rainfall to the west, and then we have increasing annual temperature going to the east. So we have all these factors, and we have to figure out where is that organism going to be in the landscape now and into the future. So that's kind of the puzzle that we're working on with the park. We have Colorado Desert to the south, and we have Mojave Desert to the north. And so looking at the deserts and the transition zone between those, and how will that change in the future? So how will animals and plants react to climate change across this Colorado to Mojave Desert transition in the future? And what was done a few years ago by Dr. Barrows and others, but right before I came onto this project, was they did a risk assessment. They looked at a vulnerability of all sorts of species to climate change, along with the park. Did a lot of literature searches and modeling, and looked at how vulnerable would all these species be to climate change. And you'll see maybe some of your, let's see if this works, favorites here, pinyon pine. Okay, pinyon pine at the top, yucca night lizard, bighorn sheep. So the species at the top of the list, what I know you can't read them all, are more vulnerable to climate change. And then coming down towards the middle, those might be less vulnerable to climate change. And down at the bottom, we've got things like creosote bush. That's a tough species. I think that'll be here forever. So those are species that we don't expect to be so vulnerable so immediately to changes in temperature. And Joshua Tree ranked really highly up there. I have it highlighted in yellow if you can just barely see that. So Joshua Tree, vulnerable to climate change. It's the namesake of the park. It's iconic. People like it, as we're all here to talk about Joshua trees. And so it's an important species. It's also, important in the community for many reasons. Looking at, of course, Joshua trees, which I think we'll all talk a little bit about biology. But of course, it's an arborescent monocot, so it is a tree-like monocot, more closely related to palm trees, grasses, than to oak trees, for instance. So you can still call it a tree, but it is actually very different than a lot of your other trees. All right. Okay, and then we've got, the issue of western and eastern Joshua tree, and I am not a plant taxonomist, so I'm not going to really get into that, but there is definitely a difference that you can see and perceive, and is bolstered by, genetic information that shows there's an eastern, Joshua tree form, and there's a western Joshua tree form, and recently, even the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decided, yes, there are probably two species of the tree. I think the taxonomists actually needed to catch up to that. They sort of jumped ahead with that, but it's really interesting, and that would even make it even more vulnerable to climate change. My circles aren't exact there, but you can kind of get an idea of the general distribution of the two, whether they are subspecies, full species, and of course, in the western area, we have our beloved western Joshua tree. And we are most importantly at the southern range extent of the Joshua tree. So remember that when we think about climate change being like a wave of heat, pushing species upward, uphill, and to the north, we are at the southern extent. So this is where we're going to start to see some of the most immediate impacts of climate change as they're happening. So, as you know, this is not the first paper to come out about Joshua trees and climate change. There had been some other looks at this. So Cole et al. Said, by end of century, habitat would be severely reduced. We know that they're threatened to cross the ranges by invasive species and fire as well. And one of the problems that I think we can talk about is, they don't have a long distance dispersal agent. So they're not able to, we don't believe, disperse long distances. So again, that's why we're focused on refugia. Where can the species hang out or just disperse a few meters without having to make great, vast distances in space? So what we're really focused on, and I'm a plant ecologist, or actually a plant biologist by training, so I'm really looking at seeds and fruits and biological processes. We can say, okay, increases in temperatures and decreases in precipitation are going to affect especially young seedlings. Anyone who's grown a garden knows, you have to water it right away and nurture those seedlings until they get established. So any real aridity and problems with temperature and precip is going to impact those seedlings. And what do you need to have seedlings in order to have older trees. You can't just come up with older trees out of nowhere. So the children of the future. So what we wanted to do is look at especially where the young seedlings are in the landscape. And those shifts, again, due to any kind of change, might be first evidenced by where are the seedlings most happy, because you're not, again, going to get adult trees unless you have those seedlings in the landscape. So in general, how are Joshua tree populations weathering these changes? And again, working with the park on management. So what we did first was we did a habitat model. We took various GIS layers of topography and precipitation and water deficit, and we aligned that with point distribution. So I actually got data from iNaturalist and from the park, all sorts of point data that allowed us to parameterize a model and say where the Joshua tree is most happy in the landscape, their ecological niche, essentially. So we made a model of the ecological niche, and we projected on where's the habitat in the landscape. We did that for the present as well as the future. And then, remember this graphic, there are various futures that are possible. So there's the highly mitigated scenario. This is one where we do something about our emissions and we do something about climate change as a globe. We have a moderately mitigated scenario and a business as usual scenario. So we all keep driving our cars, all over the place, and we just keep doing the same things. In those, generally the business as usual correlates with a much higher temperature increase towards the end of century. So we wanted to say something about what might happen and what might happen in the worst case scenario as well. So we modeled the historic range first. So this is just point data looking at where the Joshua Tree occurs in the landscape, where it could occur based on the data. Then we looked at the highly mitigated scenario. So this is what the habitat would look like towards end of century, 2070, 2100. This is suitable habitat for Joshua trees within the park. That was our modeling boundary in the buffer there. So down to about 19% of the historic range. If we look at the moderately mitigated, and we have a sadder Joshua tree on the slide, that would be down to about 14% of the historic range potentially. And unfortunately, if you look at the 2070 to 2100 in the business as usual, we're really concerned about what this would look like for our national park, for all the plants and animals that rely on this tree as well as the tree itself. So we're down to 0.02% of the historic range. So again, we don't know what that would look like on the landscape. That's what we're going to try and figure out, but we hope that this doesn't happen. So as we talk tonight, we'll try to be optimistic about it. But this is what our published paper showed. Then we wanted to say, okay, well, a model's a model, but all models are wrong to some degree, right? No model's perfect. So let's say, is this true in any way? So we know that the first indication of climate change might be where the seedlings are occurring in the landscape, where are they most happy? And we know that there has been a change in temperature and precip already. So how have they already responded to that? So we went out, we took community scientists, groups. Thank you to many of those in this room that actually participated in the study. Thank you so much. We measured lots of trees with community scientists in these 400 by 400 meter plots to get a rate. How many seedlings are occurring per plot across the landscape. So from that, I was able to produce these are the demographics of each plot. So for each of these, essentially we're using height as a proxy for age. So the taller you are, the older you are in this data. But you look at some plots off to the northwest that have a lot of a higher number of young adults that are in green there. So the bars that are in green are the numbers of seedlings and smaller individuals. And then you look down to the right and look at some of these drier, hotter areas, and those have less seedlings for every adult. And as we know, that's probably not a very successful demographic situation to be in. You need a lot more juveniles to survive to adulthood. And so those populations might be a little bit more in trouble. And we looked at sort of a 60 centimeter cutoff for that. And so then we took the model of actually the optimistic scenario where this is the place in space they will be happiest at end of century, we hope, if we all do something about climate change. And we said, well, where are the plots that are, as we called them, recruiting? Basically, they have adequate number of young trees. Where are those really good recruiting plots that are like we're rooting for? And those actually corresponded the best. They were either within or near those modeled refugia. So really the field data backed up what we were seeing in terms of the model. So that was reassuring. It's still concerning, but at least we know that if there's a problem, at least we're getting a handle on what it is so that we can do something about it. And if we look at just how will the Joshua trees survive, one way is topography. Like I said, we have these refugia in the park because of that nice topography. So we've got higher elevation areas and low elevation areas, a lot of diversity that allows us to have good topography. The nice thing is hills and slopes let Joshua trees escape that climate change heat kind of faster. If you think about climate change kind of as like a flash flood or a heat wave coming in, what are you going to do? You're going to jump up, jump up onto something, and you can escape that heat wave. Whereas if you have to run away from it, you're going to have to run a long ways further north to get away from that. So that's essentially what it is. You could go 10 meters up in elevation in general, or you can go 10 kilometers further north to escape that, or to stay in the same climate zone. So that's what we're thinking about when we think about Joshua trees, is where are they going to move to? And a lot of the areas further north that do support Joshua trees, and we did not model that habitat, we want to next, those are on flat area, that's a lot of flat ground there. So if you think about how they'll try to escape that heat, it might be difficult. And remember, wherever they're going, there's already existing vegetation. And so we're going to start to see different species interactions as things go on. So that's really interesting, and that's a research direction for us, is to see range-wide what's going on, and how will those species interactions occur? What will the community look like? Will it still be black brush and Joshua trees happily together, or will we have creosote bush and Joshua trees? It'll be really interesting to see, to say the least. Okay, so moving further north or moving, upslope, that's the way Joshua trees will survive. So we're rooting for them. Joshua trees, of course, also got a lot of attention this fall. It was really honored to have a lot of press approach us about this research that's also up in Black Rock. We had CBS News come out with us. That was really neat. Cameron talked to local news. I talked to local news. It was just great to see so much attention paid to our very beloved, Joshua tree species. So in terms of what can you do, and I'm sure we'll circle back to this with the other presentations, thinking about, what can all of us do? Participate in science, if you can. It can be a challenge for a lot of people to make connections and come out. I'm going to put my contact info at the end of the presentation, as well as Canberra's. And if you want to come out and take data with us, it's a good way for people to learn how we as scientists do this, and to learn to trust science. I think it's an important part of that, the trust between the public and people who do the research. Support education to understand that these findings are science-based. Here, this isn't political, this is a science-based finding. Support renewable energy development is another way to hopefully curb these carbon emissions. Support seed banking efforts. There are different entities, including local entities like Mojave Desert Land Trust, that are doing seed banking, which is important to start to think about the future, restoring areas if we have to support Joshua trees. So those are usually, gardens, societies, land trusts. Understand issues of environmental justice as well. Understand that not all communities are going to be affected the same. Based on climate change, a lot of certain communities are going to be disproportionately affected by that heat, by their electricity bills. So just understand that not everyone's so privileged to be able to escape these effects of climate change. Support equity, diversity, inclusion in science. We need all the voices we can in this field, all the ideas. And support access to parks and open space, which we'll talk more about. So in conclusion, we were forecasting climate-related shifts in Joshua trees and other populations, and that's very important to conservation, because we can't just conserve things where they are anymore. We have to look ahead, look what's going to come into our parks from other places, and look what's going to move out of our parks, maybe into other places. We validated the predictions using field data. We've been out and looked on the landscape and said what is happening to support the modeling. And we are seeing that perhaps supporting the species in situ where they are avoids us having to guess where they could occur in the future as well. So those refugial habitats are really important to protect as well. And again, concrete research on iconic species is really motivating to the public. Maybe the koala is now taken over as the emblem of climate change, sadly. But hopefully as we pick up some of these stories that people can connect to, it'll just help us all think about this issue, spread the word, and talk to our friends and family about it. All right, one more shout out to the partners. Want to thank them, thank the park for being fantastic partners. Earthwatch, Spring Break Groups, Jason Learning, National Park Association, Mojave Desert Land Trust, among others. So the take home is, future may be troubling for Joshua trees. We've already measured that there are some changes occurring in where the new seedlings are occurring on the landscape, and things are likely to get worse. But as I showed you, that future depends on human action, and we can tie it, directly to that. So we're looking at preserving that habitat, at least that 20%, versus not. So it's something to think about as we go about our daily lives and try to improve our carbon footprint. So on the bottom here, like I said, I have my contact information as well as Cameron Barrows, who works at my office. We have citizens come out and measure data in the field with us. We have a good time, so consider coming out. And that's all I have. So thank you very much.
Hello, neighbors. Hope everyone's well. As Daren mentioned, my name is Chris Clark. A lot of you know me. Those of you who don't, I am a writer who fell in love with Joshua trees about 30 years ago. And I find myself in this kind of position a lot where I'm on a panel flanked on either side by people that actually know what they're talking about. And I just wanted to encourage you to check out for yourself if there's anything that seems interesting or strange. I do get things wrong. In fact, I was about 5 years ago in this very room giving a presentation on something that I kind of knew something about, and at the end of it, a person who was actually an expert in the field came up to me and introduced herself and said, that was a great presentation. Do you want to know what you got wrong? And we're married now. So from which I would take away two things. One is that I am fine with being corrected, and the other is that you might want to consider the consequences. I was hoping to bring a note of optimism to this discussion tonight, which, speaking of things that I don't really know all that much about, optimism is on the list. But there is some cause for optimism with regard to the Joshua tree, because the Joshua tree brings certain things to the table, ecologically speaking and physically speaking, that might help it out through this difficult time. There's still certainly a lot of reason to worry and to do what we can to help the species, but it does have some traits that may help it. And one of them is it's a pretty plastic organism. There are a lot of different variations in Joshua trees, a lot of different regional differences. This is a photo of the Bullard Wash Alamo Road area in central Arizona, not far from Wickenburg, and you may notice there's a very strange plant in the middle of all those Joshua trees. Joshua trees actually do grow, at least this population of Joshua trees can grow in the same conditions that Sonoran desert plants like, and Sonoran desert plants are acclimated to a bit more heat, a bit more conditions like what we may see in this part of Southern California in decades to come. So it's possible. We're a little bit further south here than this population is, but not by all that much, and it's possible that some of the genome of these Joshua trees here might be really, really important in the species survival, or species either singular or plural, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But the tree does grow in a lot of different habitats. This is northern Arizona. Those cliffs in the background are the Grand Wash Cliffs, which are sort of where the Grand Canyon ends. So Joshua trees do live in canyon country. And they also live near Canyon Country, Los Angeles County. This is actually one of the lesser known state parks in California. It's the Ripley Desert Woodland, which is a really cool and very small place. What we heard briefly, and some of you have heard before, that there are a couple of possible species in the course of deciding not to list the Joshua tree as threatened under the Federal Endangered Species Act. The Fish and Wildlife Service said, we're going to treat them as two species, which echoes what some biologists have been saying. Others are a little bit more cautious. But on the left here is the western Joshua tree, which we will refer to right now as Yucca brevifolia. And on the right is the eastern Joshua tree, which is, according to the Fish and Wildlife Service, best considered Yucca jaegeriana. And that's the last Latin I will use. But there are a lot of differences between the two groups of Joshua trees, the most important ones of which most of us would not notice in the field unless we're in the habit of gathering moths that show up only during certain times of year and dissecting them with a hand lens and knowing what we're looking at. But there are some things that the random hiker can pick out. And one of them is that despite the Latin name of the western Joshua tree as defined by U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Yucca brevifolia, which means short-leaved yucca, it actually has longer leaves than the eastern Joshua tree. So somebody's going to have to answer for that. The eastern Joshua tree branches more readily than the western. Shorter leaves and branching more often are probably adaptations to drought stress. This tree, the eastern tree, grows further from the ocean, further from monsoon storms, and why don't I just show you a map? The blue splotches are the western Joshua trees range, and the green splotches are the eastern Joshua trees range. You may not be able to see it at this resolution, but there's a little sort of a teal splotch up there just below and to the right of the label for Nevada, plot 22. That is the Takehome Valley where both species grow. It's the one place where they both grow naturally together. When the Fish and Wildlife Service decided not to list the species as threatened and decided it was actually two species, one of our neighbors took advantage of that and said, okay, well, if you're going to call them two species, then I'm going to petition the state of California to list the western Joshua tree as threatened under the California Endangered Species Act. And Brendan, if you want to wave so that we can all applaud you for doing that, that's still pending. Brendan Cummings with the Center for Biological Diversity and a longtime neighbor of ours. And he makes a good point in his petition because if you look at the main section of habitat for the western Joshua tree, which is that sort of boomerang-shaped or flying wedge-shaped patch down in the lower left, you think about we're right around where that number 2 is next to the big dot, number 4 is over in the west end of the Antelope Valley, and then 10 is up somewhere in the vicinity of Ridgecrest. If you can imagine a place on Earth that is under more development pressure, I'd like to know about it. Climate change is not the only thing that threatens Joshua trees. In fact, in parts of the range of the western Joshua tree, one of the things that threatens Joshua trees is our attempts to mitigate climate change by building utility scale solar in places where we might disagree about whether or not it's appropriate. Lots of Joshua trees have been pulled out of the ground and killed in order to put these solar plants in. So, I mean, it's just one kind of development. And you can make a really good case that if we're splitting the two species, the western is much more threatened by climate change and the range of other related and more or less unrelated threats. But the western Joshua tree also has a couple tricks up its sleeve, which we'll talk about. This is one card too many got chirped over. Joshua trees don't grow in isolation. They're part of communities wherever they grow. Sometimes those communities are bulldozed soil in places like Yucca Valley. But a lot of the time in areas that have been protected or allowed to grow naturally, they have suites of vegetation that accompany them that contribute to their success as trees or sometimes interfere with it. And one of the most common companions Joshua trees have, as Lynn mentioned a little bit ago, is blackbrush, Coleogeny. I don't know if any of you were able to read that prioritized list of plants nearby that were likely to suffer from climate change. Coleogeny, blackbrush, was higher on the list than Joshua trees. And blackbrush is really, really important to Joshua trees. It is one of the most effective nurse plants for Joshua trees. A nurse plant being a plant that shelters a seedling or a young plant, protects it from things like exposure to the sun, desiccation from wind, predation by rabbits and rats and things like that. And blackbrush is a very, very effective nurse plant for Joshua trees. Blackbrush is also very susceptible to the same kinds of climatic threats that Joshua trees face. They're both basically relics of the Pleistocene in the Mojave Desert. They're plants that really liked it a lot better in the Mojave Desert about 15,000 years ago. It was a little cooler, it was quite a bit wetter, and there were conditions where each of them could germinate a lot more often. Coleogeny does not germinate real well these days. It's not unheard of, but it's pretty rare for coleogeny to germinate. And it's not just germination that's important, but survival through the next few years until it is old enough to bloom and set seed. You know, you can germinate all you want, and if you die in 2 years, it does the population no good. So this is, I'm actually not sure where this is. There are places in the range of the Joshua trees where there is a lot of blackbrush and it's doing pretty well. We're not in one of those places. This is a photo of the middle of the Mojave Preserve, taken in August 2005. This is off of Cedar Canyon Road. This is part of the Hackberry Fire Complex, which burned a huge amount of the Mojave Preserve in that year. This was probably a backfire that was set by fire control crews to try and control the spread of the fire, but nonetheless, the same thing happens, which is you lose the blackbrush, most of the Joshua trees die, and that blackbrush is not coming back anytime soon. As an example of what a landscape like this might look like a few years later, here's Covington Flat a couple of years ago. There was a fire in Covington Flat in 2006, and you can tell both in the foreground, the dead Joshua trees a giveaway too, but both in the foreground and the background, we have the darker slopes that have, some of it's plants other than blackbrush, but in the distance there's a good cover of blackbrush in the upward facing slopes. This mountain here, burned, that's devoid of blackbrush. We're right on the boundary of the burn here, so you have some dead Joshua trees and a little bit of scattered blackbrush and some live Joshua trees right in front of us. Healthy blackbrush on this side, it's gone on that side. There was a study a few years back that examined the rate of recovery of blackbrush communities in the Death Valley area in Panamint Mountains. And they looked at blackbrush communities that had been disturbed by things that they could date, whether they were mining encampments from the 19th century or landslides that they could date due to the deposition of desert varnish on the top surface. And they concluded that, and I remember the phrase almost verbatim, I really should have made a slide of it, recovery is expected to take longer than current periods of climatic and geological stability, which translated a little bit means more than 8,000 years, probably more than 15,000 years for a blackbrush cover like that to come back, given current climatic conditions. And so, what happens after that? Well, something grows in that space that the blackbrush freed up. And this is in the park. I think this is off of the Boy Scout Trail in the south end. You can see that that's not bare mineral soil in between the shrubs. This is actually an unburned stretch of desert, and fire is not the only way that this happens, but the spaces in between the plants that, if you'd been there 100 years ago, would mostly have been bare mineral soil, maybe some cryptobiotic soil crust, things like that, have been filled in by introduced grasses like Mediterranean split grass or red brome. And what happens when that happens is that fires spread a lot more readily. Instead of a lightning bolt striking a Joshua tree and burning the Joshua tree and the blackbrush that's right next to it and maybe a couple other things and then going out, you have fires that just spread for yards and then miles. And the more often that happens, the harder it is for the native desert vegetation to survive, but the grass comes through it just fine. It sets seeds that survive the fires and they sprout the next year even more abundantly, and there's less competition for water and sunlight. So it's a process that is often called type conversion, where you have something that was a succulent garden, shrubland, cactus forest, and it becomes a grassland of annual grasses. Patrick Gonzalez, who was here this week, climate scientist for National Park Service, put out a really great study in 2018, which was compiled into a report published last year on climate change in Joshua Tree National Park, which is available from his website. And I didn't think to put his address on the study, but I can get it to you if you want it. He makes a lot of maps that look really, really good like this, talking about changes in climate that have already happened in Joshua Tree and some that are projected. This is a map of projected precipitation increase by 2100 under the highest emission scenario. The darker the blue, the more precipitation increases as a percentage of current. And as you can see, under the highest emission scenario, the east end of the park is expected to have significantly more rainfall than it does now, 4% or so. Doesn't seem like a lot, 4%, but that is enough to make sure that invasive grasses have a much easier chance of surviving from year to year. So right about now, you might be wondering where the optimism was that I was talking about. But it turns out that the western Joshua trees, as threatened as they are, do have a couple of tricks up their sleeve that might prove really useful in the centuries to come. And this is a population of trees near Walker Pass in the vicinity of Ridgecrest, and you may notice that these trees are all kind of short compared to the ones that we have here, the big many branched ones that make people's Instagram pages or the news when they get broken by heavy snow loads or whatever. These are younger trees, but they're growing in clumps, and the trees in this section of the trees range essentially along the east slope of the Sierra, where it fringes into desert, and the Tehachapis, and then somewhat in the San Gabriels as well, are really, really adept at growing from root sprouts. They'll grow up like that for a few decades, and then they send out these runners just below the surface of the ground, and you see these little sprouts coming up all over. And it's generally considered, from what I've heard, that this is probably a response to increased fire. Fire is a lot more common in this part of the desert. And in fact, there are some places that don't really qualify as desert that are at the westernmost part of the Joshua Trees range. This is a grove of Joshua trees that I had wanted to visit for a long time by the time I actually got there. This photo was taken in 2006. And there wasn't quite the number of Joshua Tree fanatics online that there is now. So I was kind of wending my way through the information as I could find it. And I had not known that this had burned a couple of years before. For those of you that know the geography of LA County, this is in Gorman, just south of Gorman. And that stripe that's sort of in the towards the left, the horizontal stripe, is a frontage road for Interstate 5. So it's really, really close to the highway. And I had known that this grove existed for a while. It apparently slid into place along the San Andreas Fault over the course of a few 100,000 years. And it's still moving. So, you know, it may end up outside of San Francisco before too long. But I was really disheartened. This is at the end of a reporting trip in the desert in which I'd just been surrounded by bad news. The precursors to the border wall were going in, and I just really, really needed a little bit of Joshua Tree time, and I finally found this grove and pulled up, and that's what it looked like. And I almost didn't get out of the truck. But I did. And I noticed that there was something going on. At the base of every single one of those trees were sprouts like that, which there's a lot of different reasons that that's important. There's a lot of different things you could say about it, but to me, it just says that despite the threat that climate change poses to the Joshua trees, the trees are not giving up. And that, I think, means that we shouldn't either. So, thank you.
Just a reminder, we have question cards for all of your many questions. So just wave to Amanda to my right and Spider, who is back in the left, and will give you the question cards and a pen, and then you can pass your questions back to them. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak tonight. I'm so excited to see so many of you here tonight on a Friday night. You could be out at a concert or at home watching a movie, but you came here, and that really means a lot to me. It shows that you really care about the park and its resources, and you care about your community. So thank you. I really appreciate you being here. I think I'm going to have a little bit of overlap with Chris's talk. Lynn and I did coordinate a little bit on what we were talking about, but so that's okay. I guess I'm just going to probably corroborate a lot of what Chris talked about. So I'm going to talk about three things. Firstly, I'm going to talk about how I've obtained the knowledge that I'm sharing with you tonight, which primarily comes from field exploration and from some monitoring plots that we set up over the last 4 years, in addition to the plots that we're collaborating with Dr. Sweet on. I'm also going to share some research needs that I think we have for Joshua trees to better understand how Joshua trees are going to respond to climate change. And then thirdly, mostly what I'm going to talk about is about management and some of the actions that the park is beginning to take to preserve Joshua trees in refugia, in the areas where they're most likely to persist. So, field exploration, this is the fun stuff. I think getting out there is key for managers to understand the condition of resources that they manage. And I spend most of my time at a desk and going to meetings, but in my free time, I get out. Any chance I get, and I go out into the park, and I've really focused my exploration on the range edge of the Joshua tree, and I've been slowly gathering observations of the exact distribution of Joshua trees in the park. It's really fun stuff. So some of the areas that I target, one is the Hexie Mountains in the central part of the park. The top two photos here are from the Hexie Mountains, fried liver wash. Joshua trees grow below 3,000 feet in fried liver wash in the Hexie Mountains. The northern side of the park, kind of the area south of the Panorama Heights neighborhood, the southern end of Sunfair Road, that's where the lowest Joshua trees in the park are found, and they grow down to about about 2,800 feet in elevation or so. And I think a couple years ago, I was hiking along the thermal Berdue Canyon corridor in the Little San Bernardino Mountains, and I think I found what is the southernmost naturally occurring Joshua tree in existence, and that's a picture of it there in the bottom right. So kind of cool, fun stuff, field exploration, and really important. So out of that, we have this distribution map of Joshua trees in the park. So if you look at that map there, the areas that are colored orange, those are the mapped Joshua tree woodlands. Those are areas where Joshua trees become abundant enough to be mapped as an association, a vegetation association or a vegetation alliance. But Joshua trees grow in a much broader area than just those woodlands. They grow at really low densities in a lot of other areas in the park. So all those little dots on that map represent occurrences where Joshua trees have been found. The red dots are where we knew Joshua trees grew up to about 2012. And the green dots are new locations where we found Joshua trees. And actually, I've got quite a few dots to add to this map that I haven't yet. But that blue outlined polygon, that's about the approximate location of where Joshua trees grow in the park, as we know now. There's still a lot more work to do with this. So in addition to field exploration, starting in 2016, in addition to the plots that we were collaborating with Lynn on, we started putting in some other plots. These are 19 plots here. And I'm going to use data from these plots to help explain some things about Joshua trees. So all those little squares on that map are plots. Maybe worth noting are the little purple squares. Those are what are called range edge plots. Those are plots that we put in right on very close to the edge of where Joshua trees grow, in the lowest elevations. These are areas that where we might already be seeing effects of climate change on Joshua trees. And if we were ever to be able to evaluate a range contraction of the species, this would be where we might see it. So I think those are really key. Okay, the second part of my presentation, I said I was going to talk a little bit about some research needs I think we have for Joshua trees. And research need number one is I don't think we fully understand really the environmental tolerances of Joshua trees. We know that Joshua trees span a pretty wide elevational range. And the photos here are, so I like to explore areas where Joshua trees grow, just like Chris does, outside of the park as well. So these photos here, this is the highest elevation Joshua tree that I've found and the lowest elevation Joshua tree that I've found. So the highest elevation, it's at 7,400 feet in elevation in the San Bernardino Mountains, in the San Bernardino National Forest. I don't know that this is the highest elevation Joshua tree in existence, this is the highest I've found. And then the lowest one I've found is in Butler Valley in Arizona, in kind of central western Arizona, kind of Chris's first slide of the Joshua tree growing with the saguaro. This is kind of near there, but a little farther to the west. And that was at 1,650 feet above sea level. So pretty low in elevation. So that's a really broad range, spanning a lot of different vegetation types. So, so how do we know about the environmental needs or, the environmental tolerances of Joshua trees? Well, part of how we know that is from that distribution data. So we're looking at where Joshua trees grow, and then we examine the environmental conditions at those locations. So from that data, we know that Joshua trees can grow in areas that receive, on average annually, from 3.2 to 29, a little over 29 inches of rain. So it's a really big span. And then also from a physiological study, we know that Joshua trees can withstand a really large temperature range from 12 degrees Fahrenheit to 138 degrees Fahrenheit. So again, this is a really wide range of conditions. But it's more complex than this. It's more complex than these numbers. There's a lot of other things that matter. Like for instance, just not the average annual amount of precipitation, but the timing of that precipitation and the amount that comes in a storm could be really important. And one way that we could better understand that is by studying the ecophysiology of Joshua trees. So ecophysiology is the study of the adaptation of an organism's physiology to environmental conditions. So, thinking about things like, how do those shallow root systems absorb water? How do Joshua trees store water? What are their transpiration rates? I think there's a big need for research in this regard. Research need number 2 deals with reproduction. How often do Joshua trees reproduce from seed? And I hear a lot about a lack of seedling establishment and concern about that, and we need to be very concerned about that. But unfortunately, we're never really going to have a baseline to understand, prior to climate change, how often Joshua trees reproduce from seed. However, I would suspect that reproduction from seed would be quite infrequent naturally. Joshua trees are mast species. So what that means is that they don't flower and fruit and produce a seed crop every year. 2019 was a banner year for Joshua trees. We saw that Joshua trees had an unprecedented early bloom starting around Thanksgiving of 2018. And from then, Joshua trees just continued to flower, and the bloom was widespread across the park and really across the entire range of the species. And we saw just massive fruit production in 2019. And how often do we get years like 2019? Maybe some of you that have been here for a really long time might have that in your head, but the only thing that I know is that there's a gentleman by the name of Ray Yeager in Yucca Valley who's been recording the timing of flowering and fruit production on his property in Yucca Valley for a couple decades now. But that's the only study I know that's looked at that. So I think this is a really important research need for us. And I have an idea of how we can do it, and I might need your help. We could, through the help of volunteers, do an annual bio-blitz and go out to these plots and record how many Joshua trees flowered and how many of them are fruiting, how many fruits are out there, and I think we could start to build a really robust data set. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about seedlings. What I will say is there definitely are more seedlings at higher elevations. Very many more seedlings at higher elevations than at the low elevations. But I hear a lot of people saying that there are absolutely no seedlings establishing in the low elevations, and that's not true, really. There are seedlings out there. Maybe this is one reason to be optimistic, but I find them pretty regularly on the range edge. And our plots also show that there are seedlings at lower elevations. And if you look at this graph, on the y-axis is percent of the population that is under 60 centimeters tall. And the x-axis is elevation. So on the left side of that graph is a lower elevation. And we actually see at some of those low elevation plots, there's actually a higher percentage of the population that are under 60 centimeters tall. But my concern is these juvenile Joshua trees that are out there. Are they going to be able to persist and withstand droughts? Just another example of that. This is one of our plots. This is a 500 by 500 meter plot. This is at 3,300 feet in elevation. It's just south of the 29 Palms entrance in the park where you first start seeing Joshua trees. And this plot is just, it's got lots and lots of juvenile Joshua trees. I don't know why, but you can see most of them have nurse plants. A lot of them are using dead shrubs as nurse plants. Okay, this is where I'm going to overlap with Chris a little bit, I think. So research need number 3 is, I think we need to have a better understanding of asexual reproduction in Joshua trees. Or otherwise known as sprouting, or sprouting from rhizomes. In that ecotone of the southeastern Sierra Nevada and the Mojave, you see just widespread sprouting. You just see areas that are just covered in thickets of sprouts. But we have sprouting in the park as well and in other areas. And sometimes you'll see a situation where the main stem, an old Joshua tree died, but those sprouts still survive. And this is kind of the strategy for long-lived desert perennials. This is the norm for them. And if you think of like the king clone creosote that's thought to be 11,700 years old, it's sprouting from the roots. There are Mojave yucca rings that are thought to be 2,000 years old. And Joshua trees do this too. But I don't think they do it at quite the extent that some of these other species do that. So this is something that we're measuring in our plots. You know, how many sprouts are out there? How big are the sprouts? So just a little bit of data from our plots, and this is a little hard to explain, but overall sprouting in the park is really variable from across the landscape. On average, 23%, I believe. Yeah, 23% of the live trees have sprouts, but that ranges from, 4 to 50%. Now that's the live trees that have sprouts, and if you look at the dead main stems that have live sprouts, it's less. You know, on average, we have 12%, but again, a really large range. And we measured one Joshua tree that had 160 sprouts. That was not fun. Some of you may have helped us measure that one. Okay, now I'm shifting gears again, and I'm going to talk more about management. The actions the park is starting to take to preserve Joshua trees and refugia. So this map ought to look fairly familiar. Lynn showed you this map. These are the mapped refugia at the kind of a low, the highly mitigated scenario, and then the business as usual scenario. You can't really see the business as usual on there because it's so small. So, and Chris touched on this, but climate change isn't the only threat that Joshua trees face. There's this other threat, these invasive annual grasses. So in the park, it's hard to find anywhere where we don't have at least some cover of non-native invasive grasses. By far the most abundant one that's widespread in the park is schismus, or Mediterranean grass. But at the higher elevations and on the western side of the park, we also have cheatgrass and red brome. Now, these grasses are changing our fire regime. They're making fires more frequent. Fires tend to be larger in size. They burn at a higher severity. The native plants are slow to recover following these fires, but the grasses come right back. This can fuel what's called the grass fire cycle, where you're more likely to get a fire in an area that's already burned. And we do have some areas in the park that have burned 3 times since the 1970s. So if you overlay the mapped refugia with the park's fire history data, you'll see that those two areas overlap. So the areas that we are more likely to get a fire, the areas that have already burned, are the same areas as those refugia. So this is a problem. It's kind of a double whammy. We're fortunate to have these areas where we think Joshua trees can persist, but we could also lose those areas because of invasive grass-fueled wildfires. So this is very compelling that we need to be doing something about this as a park to prevent these areas from burning. I do want to say that Joshua trees can survive a fire, and Chris showed some slides of this as well. And you see that in the park. You'll see where the original stem burned and died, and it resprouted. Even young Joshua trees can do that. But there was a study done in the park, and it showed, especially in these more high severity burned areas, most of the Joshua trees aren't able to do that. It could be really different, in the eastern Sierra or at some of the higher elevations in the San Bernardino Mountains, but really only about 10 to 20% of them are surviving fire in the park. And we have some plot data from burned areas to show that. This plot is in Covington Flats. Joshua trees, this is from a fire that burned in the mid-90s. And over 20 years later, we're just not seeing recovery. We're not seeing recovery on a timescale that's meaningful to humans at all. So Our resource stewardship strategy tells us that we should be doing something about this, and that we need to especially be controlling these invasive grasses and Joshua tree woodlands to protect them from fire. And I really like the second sentence on here, which says that basically it says that we need to find effective control measures, which means that, we don't already know how to do this, so we need to try things out. We need to be adaptive about this and figure out a way to protect these Joshua tree refugia from fire. So we've started doing that. But before I talk about how we did that, back in 2017, I brought some specialists out, some scientists from USGS, scientists from our own agency, as well as managers and our fire and fuel staff that are from the Bureau of Land Management. And we toured the Covington Flats area and we talked about things that we could do out there. And what we came up with was this. Now, this is a really kind of complicated map, but what this is showing is the Covington Flats area in Joshua Tree National Park. Those black lines on there, those are the roads in Covington Flats, so if you go on La Contenta Road, that's what it turns into. The pink areas are areas that have already burned, and you can see there's some unburned islands in that landscape. And that leads to the end of the road there at Upper Covington Flats, and that's one of the nicest Joshua tree refugium. Really big old Joshua trees out there, really special area. So we came up with this three-phased strategy for the Covington Flats area. And then phase one was putting in a fuel break along the road network, where we were going to remove invasive grasses from 30 feet on either side of the road, but also remove some native woody plants along the road as well from 15 feet on either side of the road. And the reason to do that was two-part, to prevent a fire from spreading across the road should one break out, but also making it safer for fire crews to be able to access this area so they could bring an engine up there and not feel like they'd get trapped because there's only one way in and one way out. Phase two is a similar design, but protecting unburned islands in that landscape. And then phase three is focused on the end of the road at Upper Covington Flats and treating invasive grasses around individual Joshua trees. So last March, we began implementing phase one, thanks to help from funding from our regional office and also from the Joshua Tree National Park Association. And we had crews go out there and they removed invasive grasses, they removed some woody shrubs. We got maybe about 2/3 of the road network done before we ran out of money. And right away we saw some challenges with this. Last year it was a wet year and we had a lot of plant growth. We went out there in March on purpose because we wanted to cut the grass, remove the grass before it went to seed, so we could get some longevity out of that treatment. But what we saw was that we had regrowth. It was so wet that year that we had lots of plants coming up and growing after March. So we got more funding and we went back out there in September and we had to redo it all over again. There's a need for repeat maintenance when you do these treatments, and that's really expensive. The last concern with this is, Joshua Tree National Park is 85% wilderness, and we're out there with power tools doing this work. And if we really want to do it on a landscape scale and strategize how to best protect Joshua trees from these fires, we need to do work in wilderness. And I did some experimentation with a large group of people, and we used hand tools only, and we were actually able to get a lot done. So, we have uncertainty here. We have uncertainty in knowing that these treatments are going to work and how we can do them on the landscape scale, but we're collecting data on them. Thanks again to help from volunteers. We've been putting in treatment plots along the Covington Flats Road network to look at how effective these treatments are, and we will adjust. We're also trying out some different strategies as well, and different tools. And one of those tools that we're trying out is herbicide. Now, I'm very conscientious about concerns about using herbicide, and we're starting out really small by putting in some test plots to see how effective it is. Herbicide in particular that we're trying out is Esplanade, which is targeted towards grass species, annual grass species. Other areas have had really great success with this herbicide in combating cheatgrass. So we're trying it out. We're going to see what happens. And these are tough times. These are kind of drastic measures that we're starting to take, and we're trying things out because ultimately we want to have Joshua trees into the future. And I don't have a slide on this, but another thing that we can do and that we're planning on doing is restoring already burned refugia. We have the capability of doing that. We have a nursery at the park. Joshua trees are pretty easy to grow, and we can replant them in areas that have burned. So I'm going to end on kind of a not so positive note, unfortunately, but we've talked about Patrick Gonzalez, who was here all this past week. It was excellent being able to collaborate with him this week. And this is from his the new publication that came out that was looking at climate change, specifically in Joshua Tree National Park. And I put this graphic up here, and it's kind of complex, but basically it's got precipitation on the y-axis and temperature on the x-axis. And if you look at this, out of these different scenarios, there's kind of two big directions. One is hotter and drier, and the other is hotter and moister. And Chris already touched on this, but I really like both scenarios are kind of problematic for Joshua trees. Hotter and drier, to me, that scenario means that we're probably going to have more drought-induced mortality, especially at the lower elevations. Hotter and moister, the Joshua trees might do okay with that, but that probably means more fire. And that may seem counterintuitive, but those grasses, these invasive grasses, grow a lot better in the wet years. So in the desert, it's the wet years when we have fire. So, and I think that's all I have. So thank you very much. If you would like to send me an email, if you have, when we're going to answer questions here, but feel free to take a picture of that slide and shoot me an email. And if you'd like to help us out with volunteering and help us collect data or help us treat invasive plants, we would love to have your help. So thank you very much.
So now this is where the fun stuff gets to come in, and I know there's some questions that have been collected, and as those come up to me, I'll definitely start there, but I get the opportunity, since I'm standing here, to ask the first question or two, just because that's the way I'm going to take a little presidential privilege, right? And obviously I'm new to the neighborhood, and I'm not sure which one of you guys would help me with this. I think most of us saw the horrible picture of Miley Cyrus in the Joshua tree last year, and I'm just trying to understand in the big picture, I've got a Joshua tree in my yard, and now I feel like I have to go hug it, but I'm kind of scared to touch it. Is it appropriate, not appropriate? Should I go hug my tree?
So, yeah, you can hug your tree. That's fine. The problem is climbing on Joshua trees and putting weight on them. Can you guys hear me? So Joshua trees have shallow root systems, and I mean you probably saw it with the snowstorm that we recently had. There's a lot of limbs that broke, a lot of Joshua trees that fell over, and if you climb on a Joshua tree and putting that weight on it could cause it to topple over. It's actually one of the more common ways that I see large Joshua trees die, following a windstorm, and if the soils are wet, you just see them get uprooted entirely. In the park, we have, it's against our rules to climb or string a hammock from a Joshua tree. But, as long as you're watching out for your personal safety, it's okay to give one a hug. Just watch out for the spiny leaves. There might be little branches that could get you in the head, so.
Thank you, Neil. Maybe one more follow-up question, just because your presentation went last on this, and specifically talking about some of the fire. And for those of you, some of you know, I moved here from Paradise, California, so that's very familiar with fire and the challenges associated with that. Is it, and maybe Lynn, I'm not sure anybody who's got these answers to this kind of thing, but is fire a greater danger to Joshua trees, or is climate change a greater danger to Joshua trees? I mean, I know that they go hand in hand, but
Is this one on? Okay.
They're winning.
So, well, in some sense, we might see an increase in wildfire due to climate change, which will then also impact the Joshua Tree. So it'll be potentially a double whammy. And also, if you're going to see a change in the community, this might be how that change happens, you know? So it might speed the elimination of, unfortunately, some vegetation from some areas. So that's what I would say. So pretty much both.
Yeah, I would add that when we think about large changes to complicated systems, a lot of us tend to think of just really small incremental changes piling up over a lot of years, and that does happen. But as we saw in Australia recently, sometimes it's just a catastrophe that happens, and that is how you get the majority of the change from between the way it was before and the way it's going to be after. And the metaphor I like to use for that is that sea level is rising a couple of millimeters a year, and at some point in the next 100 or 500 years, the Coachella Valley is going to get flooded by the Sea of Cortez all at once. And that's how change works. And so fire is often one of the big catastrophes that works with climate change to speed the changes that climate change will cause.
A couple of questions that came from some audience members, and I think and it sounds like, you know, frankly, you guys are very much experts in both the park and obviously the Joshua trees. But one of the questions right here is a real simple one. Within the park, where are the most threatened trees? Are they near this transition zone? Is there a specific area that, I mean, you all had mentioned a little bit about kind of the range of these trees, but is there an area that we're currently seeing significant threatening to the trees?
That's a really good question, and I don't know. It's actually a hard question to answer, I think. You know, certainly I think we are seeing higher rates of mortality at the lower elevations, but the high elevations are threatened by fire, and we've had a lot of those high elevation refuge areas already burned in fire. So it's hard to pick one area.
I have a follow-up answer, which is, so when we were getting a lot of media attention about the Joshua trees, Neil will appreciate that a lot of reporters would call up and, where are all the Joshua trees dying, you know? So we measured, you know, recruitment in stands. We didn't measure mortality, but it's something that we need to be measuring, so this is a project we're undertaking now. So what's the mortality rate across space? And that'll help us answer that question.
There was definitely and frankly, I learned a couple of terms this evening, and one of those was nurse plants. This is new to me, right? I'm an engineer by trade. I don't know anything about this stuff. And one of the questions here I think is really, really interesting to me, and we know about the nurse plant component, but do immature trees need do they have different environmental needs than the adult trees?
Yeah, so seedlings of most species are more sensitive to environmental changes than adult trees. Adult trees have the resources, they're bigger sort of, you know, thermal mass, takes a lot more to heat them up, but seedlings definitely are more vulnerable to climate change, younger stages, drying out, etc.
I assume, and a little bit of a follow-up again from the standpoint of the fire component, I assume that and again, I'm ignorant to this. I saw what happened in Northern California coming through there, but in the areas where they burn, do adult trees, do they survive the burn? And obviously the smaller trees, I assume, don't make it?
Yes, so some adult trees survive a burn, and you know, and in a lower intensity fire, there's more survival. I have seen smaller Joshua trees, not seedlings, but juvenile Joshua trees that, you know, are under a meter tall. I've seen those sprout again after a fire. But the small trees don't tend to, you know, the stem that's above ground doesn't usually survive. And really small, like little seedlings, are very unlikely to survive a fire.
So,
Go ahead.
Well, so looping back to nurse plants, what nurse plants do is they shade the seedling, provide a more moderate temperature environment, and also they bring up deeper moisture and then distribute it through the shallow soil layers. So they actually help that way as well. And if you think about a post-fire situation, as I think was mentioned, you have a lack of those nurse shrubs, so that causes a problem to generating new trees on the landscape.
And the one thing I would add is that we're never talking about a fire. We have a threat of, as Neil mentioned, the grass fire cycle in which fires become more frequent and burn the same areas over and over again. And a population of trees may have a certain percentage rate of survival of one fire. It's going to be lower for the next fire. The cumulative damage will pile up. You see a similar thing with saguaros in Arizona, where there are invasive species that fuel wildfires. So one fire can sometimes be manageable, but the prospect of endless fires on into the future is tough.
One of the things I had the privilege of attending through Copper Mountain, my role here, was a presentation made to our board that went into a little bit of this question, and I'm looking to our experts for some of the information, and there is a moth that pollinates the Joshua tree that I know with the early fruiting that happened here this last year. Does anybody want to comment on kind of the moth, I guess, that is key to the reproduction of Joshua trees?
Just in general about the moth, or?
That's what this is looking for. Is yeah.
Yeah. What can I say? So, and maybe we could probably put Yanni on the spot. We've already talked about Yanni, but Yanni looked at the early bloom that we had this past year, and part of that work involved putting out, in collaboration with UCR and one of Lynn's colleagues, we put out some traps for yucca moths, and we really did not find any yucca moths with that early bloom. However, though, I guess, to me, like, the moth is integral in pollination, or at least that's what we think. So if you're seeing fruit, that means that the moth should be there. And what I was really impressed or amazed by this past year was just seeing such widespread fruit production with Joshua trees, which to me meant that the moths must have been across all those areas where we're seeing fruit production.
There's a specific question here around a presentation from Cam Burrows a number of years ago, talking specifically about climate change, and the precursors of climate change or indicators of climate change were warmer nights. And specifically in this area, having warmer nights. What are the physical manifestations or the effects of warmer nights or night warming on plants within our ecosystem? Anybody want to take that one?
So one major factor is, and yes, the earliest signs of this climate change has been, warmer, so less cold temperatures in the winter, so warmer minimum temperatures, and then less cold nights. So two things. We all know that heat helps dry out systems, and so you're going to have less moisture staying in the soil if you're going to have those warmer nights. So that's unfortunate. And then you're going to have less frost days, which might be required to cue various, germination or flowering in some species. So both of those things impact, plants pretty heavily.
Specifically, one species that needs cold is blackbrush. It needs cold stratification for the seed to germinate, and another is pinyon pine. And I can also say from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service species status assessment that Joshua trees need a minimum winter temperature of approximately 4 degrees C or 39 degrees Fahrenheit.
So I'm going to wrap this last question up here specifically to Lynn, as it was written to you. And specifically talking about expanding your study range-wide. There was a question about the currency of the data associated with that, and what the kind of what the plans are, and the time frame associated with expanding that study.
So the first thing we need to do a study like that is some funding. So we got a lot of attention for the paper we did, which is fantastic, and hopefully it'll generate, larger grants and basically paying my time to be able to do these things. So we do need funding. We do get funds, again, from Earthwatch and through Joshua Tree National Park Association for the research partnership. But to do a lot of modeling, we need a lot of data. We would need range-wide distribution data. We had great data from the National Park Service for this study, so that's why we were able to dial it in so nicely to look at projections. So range-wide, we would need distribution data, where are the Joshua trees in the landscape, and we would need scaled-down climate data, which the data set we used was produced by USGS. Some scientists very downscaled data that is available for California. So that became available for more states that would help. So we used, I think it was 270 meter downscale, which is really great. So Cole, that first paper that came out years ago, they were looking at like a 1 kilometer scale. So we were able to look at really fine scale. So that's what's, in the cards, and it doesn't take a lot of time to press the button, in the end for me to press the button to run the model, but we need a lot of data. So it'll, I think it'll happen, especially with some of the considerations being put to listing species. I think that's something that's really needed. Are these populations surviving? Are they reproducing, and where? So it's really key. There's a Joshua Tree Genome Project, some of you might be familiar with, that's looking a little bit more range-wide, and they have the resources to do so. So we're hoping to partner with them or talk to them about that.
And last thing to close to each one of you. Best thing that any one of us in this room can do to help. And help is a very broad term, but help.
I'll say I was really glad that Lynn included that long and really, really helpful list of things that people could do to help. And there's one I'd want to add to it for sure, and that is vote. The differences between candidates have never been starker on an environmental issue than they are now. And not only does your vote at the national level matter, state and local elections matter, they're crucial. And not only are we voting on whether or not this society starts to enact a sensible climate policy in which we start ramping down emissions as fast as possible, but it also means the possibility of more funding for the sciences, more funding for the National Park Service to protect these resources, and as the cartoon said, what if climate change is a hoax and we're making this world a better place for nothing? But vote, get your neighbors to vote, drive your neighbors to the polling place. Just make sure that this vote happens this year.
Neil, you have a comment?
Yes, I think just getting involved in citizen science is a great way to help in volunteering at the park. And a couple opportunities that I will highlight are, one is getting involved in our monitoring and helping us collect the data on Joshua trees and other species. But the other thing, another volunteer project that we have that some of you are already a part of, is the invasive plant patrol. And we have a program at the park for volunteers to go out. You can do it after we train you on how to identify invasive plants. You can go out into the park, hike the trails that you like to hike, and look for satellite infestations of invasives, and you can treat them on the spot by clipping. And you report to us on what you did through an application called iNaturalist. And I think iNaturalist is a great way if you've got a smartphone and you can take a picture. You can help us collect data on invasive plants and on plant species that are vulnerable to climate change.
Dr. Sweet, last word.
Oh, well, all right. Well, hopefully a few of you were inspired by the things I listed on the PowerPoint slide. I would say you're doing a great job by being here, so thank you. Think about, my son's 2, so I'm thinking about what he's going to experience when he is retired, when he goes on his national park tour. What is he going to see? And so taking some meaningful stories from tonight, I hope, talking to your friends and family, and really the points these two brought up already, so our funding could come from National Science Foundation if it's appropriately funded. So So those are the kind of things you can do. Thank you. Thanks for being
With
here.
that, these folks deserve an amazing round of applause. So I'm going to say these folks will be here for a few minutes. If somebody wants to corner them, tackle them, and get to maybe a couple of the questions I didn't do. But I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that next month's symposium will be held on Friday, February 29th. The topic is going to be balancing tourism with conservation and preservation. I'm going to be participating once again and looking forward to seeing many of you. As the visitation to Joshua Tree National Park continues to increase, there is a need for discussion on how to balance tourism with the park's mandate to conserve and to preserve the land and the ecology of the park. Panelists of the program will be a representative of Visit California, a nonprofit organization with a mission to develop and maintain marketing programs in partnership with the state's travel industry that inspire travel to California. Scott White, the president and CEO of the Greater Palm Springs Convention Center and Visitor Bureau, and David Smith, we all know David, superintendent of Joshua Tree National Park. If anybody was out for the 29 groundbreaking for Project Phoenix, he blew up the speakers out there because he was so excited about that particular thing being built. And again, thank you all. One more big hand for our panelists this evening. Have a good evening, folks.